Good afternoon, and thank you all very, very much for joining this call today. My name is Barnaby Nelson. I run the Value Exchange, and it's fantastic to be able to have you joining today's call on T+1, the Canadian perspective. So hopefully you've enjoyed a quick moment of calming music before we get into the frenetic rush of everything that we've got to get done in the next 13 months. What we're going to be doing through this call is try to make sure that everything that you need to know about T+1 is clear within the next hour. So the way we're going to do that is we've got a fantastic set of panelists here. We have Steve Everett joining us from the CDS at TMX. We have Keith Evans joining us from the CCMA, and we have some fresh results of the industry-wide survey on operationalizing T+1, which we're going to walk through. So we're going to be going through pretty much what you need to know about T+1, what the market's doing about T+1, and obviously the most important part of all of this is making sure that your questions get answered. So throughout the next, throughout the duration of the call, please make sure that you do put your questions in, log them as much as you can, and we'll be leaving some ample time to be able to talk through all of the questions so that when you leave this call, you're completely comfortable getting on with your T+1 planning. Now, the reason we're having this call just briefly is obviously the interesting point. Sorry, I can't multitask, so we just had to put the slide up. But the key point about T+1 and the reason why these calls are so important is because of the fact that obviously this is a network play. You know, who owns T+1? Who's responsible for getting us ready? As we'll discuss in the next hour, there are all of us play a role. No single player will make us succeed, make us fail on the effort to get through T+1. But ultimately, it has to be a collective effort. It's across client counterparties, across relationships, service providers, all the way through from trade entry, those from the investment managers' side, the brokers, the sec lending, the FX providers, the system providers that underpin all of those. So really what's absolutely key is basically making sure that wherever you sit in the chain, you're comfortable with what T+1 means from an impact perspective. And second of all, that you know exactly what we need to get done in the next 13 months. So as I said, to cover that, we're going to break this down into a few pieces. First is Steve's going to talk us through essentially why we're having this conversation, particularly in a Canadian context. Keith is then going to update us on what we know so far in terms of T+1 and it's basically what the rules are, what the market guidelines are, and everything from the CCMA and all of the very intense advocacy that's been going on. And then I'm going to walk us through the survey results from our industry outreach. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Steve just to give us a bit of a view on why are we having this conversation, Steve, and particularly in a Canadian context, why is this so important?
Thanks, Bonnie. And I think really just by way of introduction, as many of you would know, the SEC in the US came with a new date, which of course Canada will be supporting 1 day earlier than the US. And this is obviously going to be mandated for us with regards to how close we are to the US markets and market functioning between the two markets. So that's really the genesis of this, much like we saw in the transition between T+3 and T+2. Keith, we're very lucky to have him on the line, who was front and center of that initiative last time. So now it's the transitions from T+2 to T+1. And in many cases, we can look at a compression of a date as simply being shortening processes. Something that used to take 3 or 4 hours, we've now got 1 hour for. However, in T+1, one of the key findings up front was it's not merely a compression of processes. In some cases, that is true, but in other cases, it's changing processes in order to reach earlier deadlines and timelines and cutoffs in order for us to reach these settlement timelines across the market. And Bonnie mentioned it really well. and certainly the view that we have from a TMX perspective, is that we play a role with our CDSX system that will be ready for T+1 come May after industry testing. However, the problem is beyond that. The problem is the network effect all the way from the buy side to the sell side. In fact, if I use an analogy of like a combine harvester that just kind of collects everything underneath it, it even affects things like private markets, affects different asset classes, equities, fixed income, and it's across that value chain. And that's really where a discussion like this is so important, because we have different voices, different parts of the industry coming together, service providers, market infrastructure, buy side, sell side, speaking about how we can collectively work to make this happen. The timeline is pretty short. One of the risks we have, I guess, in the market is if everyone's doing their own thing in an isolated way, we have that lowest common denominator risk, which could lead to some of the risks that we're going to see Barney highlight later in the day, settlement and fails and all of those others. However, as an industry, I think there's an opportunity for us to work together on some topics. We're already seeing it from a TMX perspective, whether it's solutions around securities lending, collateral management, and others that we're working with the industry on. So that's really it in a nutshell. And as an introduction, from a TMX perspective, just to summarize again, it's a market-wide thing. The value chain, the network has to work effectively together to address some of these challenges.
Brilliant. No, look, thank you, Steve. And I think to your point, for me, one of the key things that as this evolves, the new solutions that you're talking about coming available are going to be really key in terms of tracking to make sure that from a CDS perspective, that everyone's fully aware of where the help is going to be coming in, as we move. So in terms of why this is a challenge, and also why Canada is having its own webinar and not basically just lumping ourselves in with the US for T1, Keith, my apologies, put Steve back on the spot. Keith, let's talk through what we know about T+1 in Canada, and all the conversations that you've been involved in for the last several years. Can you give us a recap on what we need to know?
I'll do my best. Thanks, Barry, and thanks everybody for attending the session this afternoon. T+1 is top of mind for a lot of people now, and so here's a list of things that we're working on, and hopefully you're working on them as well. So basically, Canada has always followed the US in terms of settlement cycles. We moved from 5 to 3, 3 to 2, and we'll now follow them from 2 to 1. I think if this was left up to Canada on its own, we probably would not have picked this time frame for this to happen. But here we are, and we do need to follow the US. As most of you know, just recently the SEC had picked May 28th, 2024 for the US time frame for implementation of T+1, and this was obviously not the preferred date that we had for transition. We had been lobbying along with all of Canada, and pretty much all of the US had been lobbying for Labor Day of 2024, which was a common 3-day weekend between the two countries. And also an added bonus was that we transitioned from 3 to 2 over the Labor Day weekend, and therefore we had a lot of confidence in our abilities and the timing, and just the comfort in knowing that we could get there. May 28th is the end of Memorial Day weekend in the US, and it's a long weekend for them. However, it's not a long weekend for Canada. And so we've had to look at it a little bit differently. And I like to think of it as we're still transitioning at the same time as the US, except the first day of the transition, the US happens to be on holidays with the Memorial Day. So Canada has selected May 27th as the date for for our transition. And there's two primary reasons for that. One is we can utilize the entire weekend, or the 2-day weekend in this case, to do our system implementations and allow time to validate that those implementations were successful. It gives us 2 days. If we were to try and transition to T+1 on the same date as the US, in other words, May the 28th, those same implementations would need to be done on the Monday night. And as one large institution mentioned recently, is that in the move from 3 to 2, they spent 16 plus hours validating their system implementations over the Labor Day weekend in 2017 to ensure that they were ready for the start of trading on the Tuesday. If we were to implement on Monday, they would not have the time, if any time, to be able to transition, to validate their systems before starting the trading on the Tuesday. So it was deemed just too risky for us, and therefore having the weekend, we don't believe that having a single day of trading before the US is cause for concern or has any undue risk associated with it. We do have some things that we need to look for, but there it is. So according to our website, if you're there, we have a countdown clock, and we're now at 431 days to implementation on May the 27th. And that's 14 fewer weeks than what we had hoped for in our initial planning with Labor Day. So we're not going to be able to undertake reviews of everything and anything that we had hoped to. When we had the additional time, we're going to have to hunker down and focus on a few things. So what is it that we're doing right now is, as you know, we have a structure that's set up. We have a steering committee, and we have 4 working groups: an operations, a legal, a mutual fund, and a communication education working group, who are, it's the same structure as we used for the transition from 3 to 2. And the chairs and co-chairs of those committees are almost exactly the same as we had before. So we have a lot of knowledge. If one project implementation gets you knowledge, we do have that advantage. And those working groups look at their respective areas to make the changes. We have worked on 3 primary things so far. One is, Steve referenced it, the CDS's schedules of their jobs. We've had to revamp those to shorten the time at which things have to take place in order to affect settlement. We have worked on a comment letter that we just submitted last week in the CSA's National Instrument 24101 recommendations that they'd put out. So that has taken a fair amount of time, and it focuses solely on the affirmation rates, trades being entered, confirmed, allocated, and ready for settlement in the overnight cycle. We're working very closely with buy-side firms. So we've established within the operations working group a buy-side task force whose sole job is to figure out how do we get from trade execution to affirm trades so that it can settle overnight on trade day. And I'll leave it with these final thoughts on where I view right now anyways our primary problem areas. As I just mentioned, the affirmation rates, we have a long way to go to be ready to be able to meet the new national instrument recommendations. We need to be 2.5 times better than we are today just to meet the new thresholds. And I think that what's becoming clearer every single day is that this is not a matter of, as we did from 5 to 3 and 3 to 2, just doing things, the same things, but quicker. taking out that afternoon nap time, we're going to need to invest in more material changes, more automation, taking advantage of automated solutions out there relative to how institutional trades get entered and affirmed. The 14 fewer weeks I mentioned that we have means that we're going to have less time to look at all of the things we would like to look at to try and find efficiencies or solutions. And we're going to have to concentrate on the core items that are going to allow us to be able to transition in May of next year. One of the main areas is that CDS is revamping their clearing and settlement systems, and there is a conflict between the two projects. CDS is working on trying to sort out how they would like to try and deal with the issue of T+1 in the PTM project, which will allow us to lead towards having a fully developed and agreeable testing strategy for the Canadian marketplace. So those are the key areas that we're working on at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Keith. So I think, for me, that sets out the kind of the agenda, if you like, of the task that we have ahead of us really clearly. I mean, we've got 431 days to basically to get, to your point, the minimum standard to get 2.5 times better at basically affirmation rates plus in order to actually meet the minimum threshold, which is 14 weeks less than we expected. Exactly as you say, that really focuses the attention on making sure that we get the overnight cycle right. And particularly the buy-side task force for me is a standout piece in terms of actually making sure that at the end of the day, if we're not getting the allocations in, then everything falls. So so thanks. That sets out the framework really clearly. And just to reiterate, we will be taking in all of your questions about everything that Keith said shortly. So please do make sure that you start sending through your questions on the Q&A in the chat as soon as you can, and we'll make sure that we get to those. So we've kind of talked about why this is important. We've talked about what the challenge is that lies ahead of us. What I'm going to do now is just walk us through the results of a big industry survey that we ran just prior to the SEC's announcement and to the confirmation of the May date, really to try to underline many of the challenges around where, why, and how we are preparing for T+1, and to try to flush out basically the key considerations that we all face as we start to prepare our own transformation and readiness journey. So I'm just going to walk through the statistical findings, but before I do that, what I do want to underline is that the survey that many of you will have contributed to, and so thank you very much for those that have. The survey was run with a full view of T+1, so including the DTCC's leadership and TMX's leadership here in Canada, with the CCMA, but also with AFME giving us a great European perspective, and AZITSI giving us a great perspective from largely as well from the buy side. So the key point is, as we go through all of this, you can see that we're really talking about a pretty complete set of views and responses from around 300 firms around the world. Now, the key point I want to underline here is that this is actually more than just a survey. It's also a benchmarking exercise. What matters is helping you to understand where you are in the overall context of T+1. So if you would like to benchmark your own plans and to essentially say this is where we are, where's everyone else by comparison, then use the QR code here to complete the survey. As you do that, we'll then send you your own benchmarking scorecard so that can feed into this is where we're ahead of the game, this is where we're behind the game, and this is where we need to focus. So to break down the stats, as I said, out of this survey into 3 big chunks. The first part is ultimately how ready were we when the SEC said, right, we're off. And I think the truth is that we're really significantly less ready than we probably should have been. One of the key points about the impact and readiness of T+1 on a global basis is that, first of all, T+1 obviously is much more than just being about the US and Canada. This is a global exercise, and it's global in as much as it impacts people in Europe and Asia more strongly than it does impact people here in Canada and in the US. Now, the reasons for that are kind of obvious, in as much as you add a time zone complexity and you add a currency leg exposure and FX leg exposure as you move out of our home markets. But the key thing is ultimately that means for all of us on the call that if you are outside, then you've got more to contend with. But equally, if you have counterparties overseas, those are the people, to Steve's earlier point, those are the people that are going to be causing problems for us, holding us back, because this is where the complexity lies. That's not only about people across the respective Pacific and Atlantic kind of waters, it's also about tiering of organizations. So the smaller the organization, the more problematic T+1 is going to be. So again, it may not be that you yourself are a smaller organization. If you are a smaller wealth manager or a hedge fund, chances are this is going to be more problematic, and therefore you're going to need to put up your hand for help earlier. But equally, if you have client counterparties in that kind of smaller zone bucket, those are the people that are going to need help. And again, as Steve says, those are the people that are actually going to be causing the frictions as we move forward. But the real challenge of this is that from an impact perspective, these people are not, the people who are most impacted are the least engaged with us so far. And when I say us, I mean on T+1, generally speaking. So as we leave the North American sell side, so basically brokers and custodians, and we move out to the depository participants into the buy side, but also as we move eastwards, you can see that the number of organizations that are actually still only thinking about T+1 as opposed to acting and preparing for it rises sharply. So what this really means is that those who are most impacted by T+1 are the ones who are least engaged at the moment. And again, it's not necessarily that, I mean, you're on the call, so therefore you're probably more engaged than most, but chances are, if you're an international business, your clients are amongst these people who are least engaged. So, you know, when readiness drops to 75% of investment managers in APAC thinking that this is not a problem and this isn't something we need to deal with, that's a problem for us all in terms of readiness. So key point really, number one, is that ultimately those who are most impacted are the least ready. Now, the problem really is that ultimately is that this lack of readiness is not only, we can't only point fingers at smaller organizations and the people overseas. 41% of the industry is not ready, is not even really properly engaged on T+1 yet. So the 41% basically still researching and scoping, kind of scratching their heads, getting familiar with it. If you're in that zone, obviously, as Keith says, we have 431 days for you to move from the left to the right on this waterfall. But most importantly, if you're an institutional investor, that means about 2/3 of you are basically still in that researching and scoping phase, and we need you to move through the chain as fast as possible. If you're a custodian, you need your clients to move through, and so on and so forth. So for me, the key point really is ultimately, as I said, clients, counterparties need to be moving through the research and scoping phase. There's too many of us in that bucket right now, and we need to be moving into the funded changes ongoing as fast as possible. Now, here in Canada, I just want to expand on this tier 2 point briefly, because ultimately, as you can see, basically the smaller the organization, the less ready you are. And I touched on this, but for me, what's so key is ultimately is if 1/3 of smaller organizations coming through, as somebody said to me last week, you know, it's the 2% of volumes that's going to really mess us up on T+1. If 30% of the smallest organizations are still sending through manual trade confirmations, manual affirmations, that is going to create problems, whether you're a custodian, whether you're a broker, whatever you are. And so for me, you know, this really just reaffirms the point that the smaller the organization, these guys can't be allowed to blackmail the rest of us into actually causing headcount problems, risk issues, and settlement failures. So I'm just going to pause there and actually just I want to just get Steve and Keith's point on this in terms of the readiness. I mean, Steve, you're obviously very kind of you know, you're speaking to organizations around the world at the moment. How does this point about kind of the smaller the organization piece and then the global piece, how does that square with your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The best description I had is the famous Spider-Man meme where you have 4 different versions of Spider-Man. They're all pointing at each other, because you can have a very efficient custodian that if they get everything in place early enough, they're processing, they're fine. But you could have, for example, different formats, different standards, different timing coming in from maybe a tier 2, tier 3 buy side client. And what that ultimately means is they could be getting it in time, but then because of the different format standards, whatever, is creating a delay maybe at the custodian. That's just one example. So the point of where I'm getting to, and back onto Keith's point, was T+1 is requiring a high degree of automation and standardization across the industry. And I think that's going to be one of the big key drivers, and certainly is going to be a major role for service providers to, I think, step in, particularly given the time frame. And having a look at that slide you showed on the project readiness from tier 2 downwards, I don't know how confident we could all be that everyone will be ready by then, based on have they even funded, or do they even really know the full impact of T+1? So I guess where I'm going there is there's a responsibility on market infrastructure like ourselves, as well as some of the service providers, to be asking these questions and coming up with solutions that ultimately reduce the risk in the market, create more efficiency, because ultimately we don't want to see an increase in fails, and we'd like to see more automation and settlement.
Keith, what's your take on this, particularly if I may ask from this whole idea of it basically about being about self-readiness and then client counterparty readiness? I mean, do you see that, back to the buy side's theme in terms of actually, the real key point? How are you seeing the readiness perspective from the buy side task force, from other people that you're speaking with?
Yeah, I think you made the point during your presentation that the survey was completed by most members before the SEC made the date announcement. Yep. And I'll say that most people that I spoke to who weren't as engaged as I would have hoped, basically were saying there is no definitive date. I can't get the resources, the budget available because I have other priorities to work on. And the one thing about our industry, and particularly here in Canada, is when there's an issue, they will rally and they will get the job done when they need to. But I think that those numbers that we were seeing, if you were to redo the survey now or in a month from now, it would be substantially different. Losing the 14 weeks from what we were expecting has put a bit of a wrench in things, but I suspect people will really start moving on it now. But automation is the key for me.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks. And so to that point, the second piece I want to just walk us through briefly is then about the actual impact of where does T+1 really hit us. So there's a few pieces that I wanted to kind of drill into here. First of all, I think one of the key things that that comes out about this point about automation is it's not really actually just about automating settlements. Yes, settlements are the piece that's going to fail, and that's going to be the kind of canary in the coal mine kind of piece. But ultimately, the key point about the research that we've done is that T+1, first of all, starts in the middle office. So as we were saying, you can see why the kind of repetitive theme about the buy side, the affirmation, the allocations. Essentially, if we can get that done on time and in a highly STP, high quality way, then everything gets easier from there. If we don't, then we have a bit of a train crash. So really, the key point here is that T+1 is really about not only it starts in the middle office. It implies strongly on the buy side, especially the funding and FX desk. Settlements obviously are very, very, very deeply involved in this, but also fails management, sec lending, as you can see, is a critical area of enablement and undermining, if you like, depending on how ready we are. And then corporate actions, of course, being a key consumer of a lot of the consequences of T+1. So The reason I think this is worth highlighting is, first of all, from an automation perspective, we need to make sure that all of these departments are actually automated in synchrony, and that ultimately that, you know, we are seeing as STP move through from left to right here. And second of all, the T+1 team needs to be more than just the settlements person sitting in a room hoping that their systems are going to hold together. The organizational construct needs to be, 6 different activities sitting around the table saying, okay, are we ready to rely on each other as we move into a T+1 environment? Now, assuming that we can do that, what we have here is basically a breakdown of basically how the whole market kind of expects to be able to complete the various tasks. So from allocations to confirmations and affirmations through the kind of the overnight process, as Keith was saying. I think for me, one of the biggest problems that we continue to face, and I think to Keith's point, hopefully this has moved on, is the fact that basically 30% don't know what they're going to do yet, or certainly didn't know. So, there's this continuing theme that basically 30 to 40% of the industry still, as the SEC made their announcement, didn't know how they were going to operationalize T+1 in any way. So I think for me, the fact that basically, we carry that load with us causes a significant risk. Hopefully that number's smaller now, but equally there are a substantial, a group of people who are basically still expecting to be able to do things on T+1, which frankly, as we know, if you're sending through an affirmation at 11:30 in the morning on T+1, we know how that trade's going to go, or certainly your custodian won't be very happy about it. So, for me, key point here really is that we need to all of us need to know when we're going to be doing things, and ultimately we need to make sure that it is part of the overnight processes, as Keith says. But 2 risk factors stand out as really, really being worthy of attention at setting aside the actual trade cycle. One is securities lending. So as the survey was run, about 55% of the industry still hadn't actually worked out how they were going to operationalize their recalls. Both sell side and buy side are consistent on that. And so we know that SEC lending is a critical enabler of liquidity. As you can see in the middle, interestingly, we're not too sure on what's going to happen to SEC lending volumes, but ultimately we know that we're going to have to do something about it. And we have 431 days for that 55% on the right-hand side to be able to operationalize and get ready. Now, the other key point of risk is FX. And if you're sitting listening to this call from somewhere with either foreign clients or you are an overseas investor, and this is obviously a critical enabler to T+1. It is most important to those in Europe, not surprisingly, but it's important to all of us. As you can see, all investors of different profiles, whether you're in North America, Europe, or APAC, it is important. And the challenge here is that 2/3 of the industry, as we completed the survey, didn't know ultimately when their FX processes are going to actually materialize. So, again, 431 days to get this done. This is a key piece that we're going to need to make sure that foreign investors and foreign currency investors are completely safe and comfortable on this as we move forward. So, just to turn that over, I think Keith, I don't know if to these points about the risk points. For me, there's this point about the allocations and the need to be able to move through and bring this 40% in. I mean, do you see that? I mean, you said that you're kind of hopeful in terms of the people are actually engaging more as we go. Are you seeing more and more conversation on the SEC lending and the FX point? And probably same question for Steve.
Yeah, so certainly on the SEC lending side, and for the most part, that part of the problem is focused on the recall functionality. I know that when we spoke with SEC lending people sort of last summer, they were clearly focused on other regulatory initiatives that had a higher priority. Since the fall, this has become more of a higher priority for them to work on. So we're actually going to hear from the securities lending group at our operations working group meeting in about 2 weeks' time. And I hope to hear some optimism on how they plan on doing that. And I don't have a lot on FX at this point in time. We're looking at how we get our arms around that one within the next month.
Steve, what's your take on these as kind of risk points?
Yeah, I think just to echo what Keith was saying, I think securities lending is a pretty obvious one. It's the knock-on impact on securities lending that's the real challenge. And the recall process in Canada today is extremely manual. And when we look across the border at DTCC-like solutions, it does lend itself to kind of solving the problem at the source. So certainly from a TMX perspective, we are investigating solutions with the market actively as to how recalls can be tracked, and we can start automatically generating some of those returns in time. So yeah, that's something we're actively looking at, as well as things like being able to, project fails, auto borrow type facilities. These are things that are available in many other markets, and this is a really good time to start double clicking on that, because ultimately securities lending is always that invisible thread that kind of connects everything together. You only know it's not. You only know it's there when it's not working. It's a little bit like settlement, and securities lending, can be very complex with the amount of counterparts, simply the amount of that network effect. And then the last one is collateral. So certainly many on the call would have known about the Canadian collateral management service that we're rolling out in 2.5 months' time. And we had only planned on doing SEC lending support in 2024, but we've actually pushed that up into late this year. And the reason for that is being able to efficiently mobilize title transfer and pledges in a completely automated way, where we're in control of both the deliver and the receive leg, and not having to wait for one or the other. And what that means ultimately is just like loans can be hopped across 10 hops or 5 hops, the same is for collateral. If you have a piece of collateral that's been given out and needs to be returned very quickly, both need to be solved for. So that's certainly something that we're actively having a look at.
Yeah, no, great. And I think this is the point. I mean, we mentioned earlier on this, it's a key theme that I want to expand on now, is just this automation idea. And I think, as you said, it's a theme that stretches across all of us. Investors need to automate, brokers need to automate, custodians need to automate, and the market needs to automate. So to your point, that each of us need to shoulder our part of the kind of the change journey in that. So the last point that I want to touch on is then ultimately, what does the journey look like from our perspective in terms of actually getting ready for T+1? So I think, excuse me, why are we going to fail ultimately, and why are trades going to fail on the settlement date of the 28th of May when suddenly everything comes in? A few ways of looking at this. First of all, the kind of our Achilles heel, not surprisingly, coming into this is the amount of manual work that we do across the industry. So, the key challenges that we're up against is basically the heavy reliance on manual tasks that are basically performed all the way through the process. We know that this industry is built on a very large amount of spreadsheet usage at best, a lot of emails. These are obviously the points that, as Keith was saying, if we're going to get this right in the overnight cycle, any amount of manual processing is just basically is it just risky, but it's also slow. So that's no great surprise that it's a big part. And as you can see here on the right hand side, it's a major risk in a lot of the key areas in terms of account onboarding. If you haven't got your SSI library right, then obviously you're going to have consistent failures of matching at that level. If you haven't got your middle office feeding into your settlements, into your fails coverage and your corporate actions and your collateral, to Steve's point, if those pieces are being held together by manual processes, manual client instructions, so on and so forth, we're going to fail. The other point, though, that's quite interesting from a research perspective, anyway, is this kind of market practice reliance. So basically, a heavy reliance on third-party providers and platforms, for example, in the sec lending space, in the FX space, as you can see, this is particularly strong. This idea that basically one of our biggest challenges is third parties amongst the buy side. And the thing I want to really underline here is actually there's a very significant distinction here between those who have had a good look at T+1 and those who haven't. Those who've had a really good look at T+1 are actually much more aware that the fate rests in their hands, i.e. that they are the ones who actually need to get the stuff done. Those who are coming at this cold believe that basically that it can all be fixed by third parties. So if you're in that zone of thinking that basically that actually it's really about your sec lending provider, your FX platform, and your middle office provider to be able to fix this, I think for me, based on the statistics from the research, the key point would be probably not to actually just assume that, and make sure that you're very, very clear on what you can be doing to actually facilitate greater automation with your counterparties. Now, in terms of what we're doing about it, there's a lot here to be able to digest, but ultimately, if you're only to do a few things across T+1, first of all, in the US, you would move to basically an auto affirmation. But I think, for me, across the board, the standardization of instructions and information is a key enabler to automation, and that's why you can see that it is basically the second most kind of chosen option. So whether you're using Fix, whether you're using Swift, whatever it is at different parts of the journey, the most important thing is to standardize. The third thing I want to underline is the amount of work that's going on in the middle office. So, as I said earlier on, that T+1 succeeds and fails at that point really before it gets into a settlement. So you can see here that the increased use of SSI libraries, the increased use of basically of middle office platforms that are actually going to help to automate and moving clients away from basically manual processes in the middle office. Those are all a really, really key enabler to being able to succeed in T+1. So I think for me, really, it's very, very important to kind of zone in. If you only did a few things, it would basically be, as I said, in the US, it would be auto affirmation. In wherever you are, it's automating your trade flows, standardizing your trade flows, and having a good look at your middle office flows before necessarily you actually look at your settlements. Now, from an execution perspective, one of the key points that the survey threw up was ultimately that, again, as Keith says, this was done before the SEC announcement. And so, yes, we know that basically it was hard to be able to get funding for projects and all this kind of thing before the dates were actually confirmed. But actually, that's not the only problem we face. And, many of the biggest obstacles that we face, the most significant, are internal. And the internal issues that we face are twice as significant as those that we face externally. So this is not really a market advocacy exercise. This is an internal change exercise that relies on us being able to manage our legacy technology, to be able to secure investment resources intra-year, so to be able to steal them away from other projects that have been funded, and to be able to actually pull in the right people to be able to execute on the change. So this is a change like many others, but for me, what's really important here is the ability to recognize this and to be able to say, okay, well, look, we know we've got a challenge in our 431 days to go, but these are the problems that we need to front up against. We need to be getting the investment soon. We need to be able to isolate and get the support from SMEs, subject matter experts. We need to know what we're going to do with our legacy platforms. Can they scale? How we're going to adapt, and so on and so forth. Those are the points that we're going to have to race through, because ultimately, these are significant challenges for all of us. So what you've got here is basically how these issues are by kind of size of organization. This really is just, I'm flashing this up to really underline the point that it's not just the big organizations that are going to struggle. Tier 2 organizations, there's a key risk point here to be able to make sure that we help organizations in the mid-tier to be able to actually get the resource, the support they need, the information, the expertise, and the systems support to be able to execute on this. Now, one of the points that I just want to underline briefly is that there is a significant amount of time zone arbitrage going on. And this is really about taking T+1 as a location strategy question more than an automation question. And particularly from a European and Asian perspective, but not just these guys. This is the idea effectively of basically dealing with T+1 by moving some staff to either the East Coast or sometimes the West Coast in order to be able to make the most of the time zone differences. You can see here that about 30% of Europeans are doing that. Equally about 15% of North American firms are doing that as well. So what I want to underline here really is that this is part of the solution that people seem to be doing, but ultimately this is still a minority solution versus the automation that we're talking about. We can't just move a few bums on seats around to be able to fix T+1. It helps, but at the end of the day, all these people are going to be doing is fixing problems that are need to be fixed in minutes and hours, and it's the root cause of those problems that needs to be addressed. So the big question then is, how does this all play out? So this is basically, when are we actually doing our project work? As you can see from a Canadian perspective, the two big risk factors are really that as I said, when there's the starting pistol went off, somewhere around 30 to 40% of the industry didn't know when they were actually going to undertake their T+1 projects. If you're in that zone right now, we need to be moving you through this process as fast as we can, getting you into the fully funded stages, getting you through the legacy tech, the SME reliances and everything I was just talking about. Equally though, there's about 20% of the industry that was expecting to do most of their work next year. Now, in the 4 really effective months of basically of 2024 that we have before we go live, hopefully the announcement of the dates has shifted that. But one of the key points is that actually we've got an awful lot of people now coming into the industry after the SEC's announcement who are now saying, gosh, we need to move quickly. The problem is that this creates obviously a resourcing challenge and creates a huge strain on the amount of scarce resource that we have in terms of technology providers, consultancies, all this kind of stuff. So, the key point for me is that we need to be able, if we are, first of all, we need to be able to deal with this kind of surge in demand in the next 13 months, but we also need to make sure that, we are not leaving this to 2024 in order to be able to get ready. So, gents, thoughts in terms of kind of key points around the challenges that we face internally. I mean, Keith, what are you seeing in terms of all these basically issues and why we're going to fail, why we're not going to be ready? If you were to give your kind of top 3 views qualitatively, and only speaking for Keith, not for the CCMA for a second, what would you say? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Reasons for failing? Failing trades or failing the project?
Well, pretty much both. One's a consequence of the other, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, to me right now, I think failed trades, an increase, at least initially, is inevitable. I think with the degree of automation that is likely to be needed, getting it identified, procured, installed, tested, engaged in the industry testing that will be needed late this year, early next year for the T+1 changes that are being required. I'd be very, very pleasantly surprised if fail rates don't go up. The goal right now is to manage it to the lowest possible increase that we can, and making sure that people who are now getting more engaged are looking at the resources that they need, looking at the technology that they need to ensure that they're not just doing manual processes faster. Right? So failed trades is a concern, not just for CCMA, but for the industry and certainly for the regulators. We know that the regulators have identified a new fail fee that's being applied to the Government of Canada debt market, starting a test phase. I believe it's this summer that will run for 18 months, and then the fees will start being applied in. So clearly fail rates has got the attention of the regulators, and we need to do everything that we can to manage that. On the flip side of it, I see that we are today in a T+1 world, 92% of our trades are ready for settlement at noon on T+1, right? So that really only leaves us 8% of a problem if we did nothing. Right now, that's not to say that all those trades are going to settle, but our fail rate right now is somewhere around 1.5 or 2%. That's what it's historically been. So we're looking at trying to move the needle somewhere between 5 and 7% and get all those trades settled through. So whatever we can do to move that noon 92% threshold back to sometime during the evening, moving it back 8, 10 hours, whatever it is, will go a long, long way to minimizing the potential of that. Of course, FX and SEC lending and all those other things have to work in our favor as well in order for that to happen, for sure. So
absolutely. No, it's a really great way of summarizing it, actually. So you've kind of got the two pieces. You've got one is how to bring that 92% earlier, as you said, and then the other is what to do with the 8% and how to make sure that ultimately when we do move over to T+1, we're not looking at 8% fail rates. Yeah. I
mean, in an ideal world, that 92% would move back about 8 hours, 9 hours, and then that 8% by the time we got to noon would be dwindled to 2 or 3%. That would be the ideal world anyway. So
no, and I think again, in terms of actually giving everyone on the call hopefully a view of kind of the challenge that we're up against. That's the kind of quantum that we're looking at, and I'm sure everyone's trade books will roughly reflect that. Yeah. So look, Steve, before I ask you a quick question on PTM that's come in, I just want to reiterate that please do send through any questions you've got on the chat or on the Q&A so that we can make sure that you do come away with all of your questions answered. Steve, Keith mentioned the PTM kind of question here. What's your view from a CDS perspective in terms of how the two interact?
Well, I think the first thing is that our systems are going to be ready for the May transition. So I think that's the first thing that we want to say. We've been consulting the market on the impact of testing and the timelines and the preparedness for T+1 and how this impacts PTM testing and readiness. And given the focus that's required for T+1, we've really heard from the market that these impacts make our planned Q4 PTM launch extremely challenging. And they've strongly recommended that PTM gets implemented after T+1. So as such, we're in the process of internally reassessing the PTM program's timelines and the go live date. And we'll be able to officially communicate the revised timelines in the next coming weeks.
Cool, brilliant, thank you. So Keith, a quick question on investment funds. So there's been a lot of challenge, basically a lot of discussion about, effectively how the, ETFs in particular and everything, basically how these fit in, just given their complexities. And you've had a lot of conversations around that. Where do we stand on that in terms of impact and challenge?
Yeah, I remembered mute this time. So, I mean, it is a good question that the investment funds are covered under a separate national instrument, which is 81-102. And during the transition from T+3 to T+2, ultimately that national instrument got modified to reflect T+1. The proposal at this time from the CSA is not to make further modifications because the wording in the national instrument says it can settle within 2 days, right? So T+1 is within 2 days. So it fits in there. And the reason that they're looking at it from that perspective is that there are about half of the funds in Canada that have some holdings within the fund that are in markets that are going to remain at T+2. Europe, UK, places like that. And if they were to get a large redemption, the ability to execute the trades in those foreign markets are off by a day from what they're likely to be settling here in Canada, so if they were to go to T+2. So the way they've done it and structured it is that the manufacturers of the funds can do their own evaluation and then make a determination as to whether individual, because they've got these holdings of foreign assets, that they could remain at T+2, while funds that they have that are exclusively in the North American market could move to T+1. So I'm not sure right now what percentage of the mutual fund industry is going to move, but if you were sort of looking at it from a betting perspective, if they've got half the issues that are currently having holdings in markets that are going to be T+2, you could assume that many of those may not move to T+1. We've not had a clear direction from the manufacturers yet. They are still doing their evaluations, and the way in which they communicate it to the community, they might not even communicate that until the week before transition. So it will be sort of a hurry up and wait on that. We're trying to dig in with the manufacturers, but they've indicated that they're still undertaking their own review to see what works best for them, because they have this flexibility in the National Institute.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So a question for both of you that I think I know what you're going to say, but a question came up this morning around delays, rolling back T+1. Just wanted really just to kind of, as I said, yeah, I think I know what you're going to say, but first of all, Keith, you've been obviously very close to this from a regulatory perspective. Your views on the likelihood and scenarios of a delay to T+1 implementation?
None. It's really hard. In fact, we had a conversation with the SEC about a month ago, trying to ascertain what would qualify as a need to delay the implementation, because really the US has to delay the implementation before we will. We can't have an unsynced market. Our whole infrastructure is built around a synced market, and we would have bigger problems if we didn't go at the same time. So it's really hard to say. My guess is that by the time we get into US industry testing, so which starts in August of this year, and if they were to identify some material issue, let's say and not picking on them, but let's say with DTCC, that everybody has to use, then there could be a case presented to the SEC that a delay was required. But I think that any question around that isn't going to be even considered by the SEC until at least a year from now, sort of a month or two out from implementation. And that's pretty consistent with what we had contemplated during 3-2. We kind of had a soft date of July 1st. So 2 months before implementation, where we would have this go, no go decision. But I think it would have to be pretty material for the SEC to change. And I'm not sure there's anything in Canada that the US would consider material.
No, look, and thanks for that, because I think for me, I think it's a great point. And I think, you know, if you look at it from certainly relaying what I've heard discussed from the US side to that point, is also this: there are no provisions for that conversation to play out right now. So, you know, it's you know, I think for me, the risk of this idea of basically of the whole discussion of a delay coming up is not material at the moment, and so therefore nobody should be baking that into their plans, that actually it's okay, we don't need to do anything because it'll just roll back. You know, I think for me the consistent messaging I've at least picked up is that basically there are no provisions or frameworks yet for a rollback, so therefore it would, exactly as you said, it would be a handbrake turn if we were to do something as opposed to normal course of business. So anyone on the call
two other thoughts on that. One is during our conversation with the SEC, they said that we just announced the final rule. We're not entertaining why we would change our mind on that at this point. Secondly, the move from 3 to 2 was an industry-led initiative, right? And they had asked the SEC to make the rule changes to support the industry-led initiative. This time round, it's a regulatory initiative, meaning we, the industry, don't have as much influence around the selection of the date. But anyways, I just thought I'd throw that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think it's key that, you know, we could easily lose some of our 431 days thinking about how we would lobby for a change when actually the fact is it's probably just time wasted. So yeah, great, thank you. So look, we're on the just past the hour now, but to wind up, obviously this is a continuing conversation. You know, there's an awful lot of operational information that needs to be digested coming out of both the CDS and the CCMA. Can we maybe just talk through, just for everyone's benefit, where to go for more information, how to plug into this conversation so that it continues? So Steve, maybe can you give us a view from the CDS side about where to plug in, and then Keith from the CCMA side?
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. So from a CDS perspective, in terms of the changes CDS is making, those are being communicated via CCMA. And certainly we'd be welcome to talk to anyone about what those CDS specific changes are. However, like I said, we're actually busy with a whole bunch of initiatives that we're having reach outs to from the industry. One being a buy side matching service similar to the one we see down south. That is one that we're working on. We're working on a securities lending recall initiative, an auto borrow initiative that we are actively investigating. And then the last one is the CCMS, the Collateral Management Service, the Canadian Collateral Management Service, which we're rolling out into the market in about the next 2.5 months. So any queries or information on any of those, please reach out to me. And I'd be happy to discuss those or pass you on to someone internally.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So ultimately, the baseline that we all rely on from a CDS perspective, you know, that itself is moving as well. So people need to continue to be connected to that to make sure that they benefit from it, and that they, you know, you can remove risk by benefiting from the work that you're doing. Great, thank you, Keith. From a CCMA perspective, how do people keep up with you?
Well, there's two things. One is we have our steering committee and working groups. It's a great opportunity to hear whatever everybody's talking about, things they're working on, participate in discussions, help shape the future of the operational changes that need to be made. Join one of those, reach out to me in order to make that happen. The other one obviously is the CCMA website. We have a whole section focused on T+1. It keeps all of our newsletters, all of our meeting agendas and minutes, links to what's going on in Europe, UK, the US, and things like that. So everything is there at least to point you in a direction. Those would be the two things I would say anyways.
Great. No, look, thank you very much. So, you know, I think for me to bring it all together as we started, you know, this is a heavily interlinked project, you know, that ultimately relies on all of us turning up. You know, you've got automation work going on at CDS, you've got automation work that needs to be done to remove manual processes amongst brokers, custodians, investors. We've got to manage, standardize our communication flows. We need to make sure that we're basically doing all of this as quickly as we can so that we can avoid a shortage of resource, SME resource, and a kind of concentration of risk. And ultimately we have 431 days to do it. So when we wake up tomorrow morning, that will be 430, unless you're in Australia. But you know, the key point really for me is that this is it is a very distinct discussion playing out in Canada, as Keith has underlined. There's many different dynamics going on here. So please do stay tuned to what's coming out of the CCMA from the CDS. And as I said at the beginning, if you'd like to talk more about this, if you want to get yourself benchmarked, then please do reach out. and we look forward to being ready and celebrating in 432 days time. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.